Hey everybody, happy Monday. This is Jordan from the Glad Trad podcast. And I was perusing the Facebook forums that I'm in, a couple of groups that kind of spoof and make fun of boomer posting in the wake of Spirit of Vatican II. And there's another one called Modernists to Electric Boogaloo, Bugnini Boo, or something like that. And I came across a post that got me really, really pensive. So in Lansing, Michigan, there's a church and it's closing. It's a church that literally has been in the community for 99 years, a Catholic church. It was built by Polish immigrants during the 1920s. And so I happened upon this by mistake, and I've been watching a couple of their masses. I've been seeing their content on their website, and I've been reading articles about why they're closing. And what's very funny is this is contrasted for a lot of my experience now, because we have such an influx of people coming into the traditional Latin Mass where I'm at. I just talked to a priest who's in charge of the development of the Fraternity of St. Peter. And if you think that last year, on average, 25% growth across all fraternity parishes, this year it's probably going to be greater because of what coronavirus has done. But this also comes with a great consequence, which is that churches that are also in the area, as they've had restricted sacraments, the inability to move mass outside, sometimes the unwillingness to distribute the sacraments, or the desire to have mass in a lot of cases. There are a lot of Catholics who are voting with their feet, and we've talked about this. But of course, the great consequence is that you have a church that's 99 years old and it's empty. It's very much a situation in Europe where you might have a very beautiful church, but it's empty. And so I was reading about this closure. And by the way, watching the mass, because I know you want to know, well, is it justified? Is it not justified? First off, regardless if you're a traditional Catholic or if you attend the Novus Ordo, any church closure inside the church should be something that we grieve. It doesn't matter. I think that for the sake of the greater goal, which is the salvation of souls, we want more Eucharist. We want more of the Mass. We don't want less of it. And yes, obviously, I have a very, very hardcore stance on the importance of the traditional Latin Mass, the importance of communion on the tongue, ad orientem, chant, everything. But if there's one thing that I refuse to go into, it's the belief or the lack of belief that the Eucharist happens at a Novus Ordo. It very much does. And so therefore, we should grieve every time that there's not enough priests, that even inside what we might consider more beige or banal liturgies, that there's closure. This doesn't give glory to the church. Less churches is a bad thing. We want more. And so I was watching this, and obviously this community is very, very grieved. And I realized that it was a church that didn't seem to be totally off the rails by their liturgy. I'd say it was very middle of the road Novus Ordo. It was the kind of upbringing that I would have probably had as a Catholic. It's funny because I haven't thought about a Gloria as a glory to God in the highest, right, in the vernacular. And I'm listening to them sing, and it's small choir and just a piano, which is kind of what I've experienced growing up. And it was funny because, again, songs that I had known my entire life, but you don't really remember them until they hit you like that, pop back into my head. So, unfortunately, I was reading the articles on why this church was closing, and they cited a couple of things. They cited lack of attendance. They only had, I think, 380 parishioners in total. And who knows, out of that 380 registered, how many come to Mass? As we know, only a quarter of Catholics come to Mass in the States, so who knows what that means. And they also cited a changing demographics in the neighborhood, which is funny because I know this is a church that's built by Polish immigrants, but a Catholic finds his home in any church he sets foot in. So I think this just speaks again to the great, for 99 years, I imagine what's happened is the great dropping off. That the people who are still going to Mass, their children aren't going to Mass, if I had to guess. And I watched a little segment of their vacation Bible school, and yeah, it was an extremely small amount of kids. And unfortunately, this is something that we have to be attentive for as Catholics, because as the growth of tradition is coinciding with the grand siphoning off, some might call it the great apostasy. I don't know if it is or not, but the great siphoning off of the wider church. Catholics who have been in quarantine, a lot of them aren't going back to Mass. A lot of them don't want to have the same conditions, or the worsening conditions of what the liturgy looks like at the moment. Or there are a lot of them, a ton of them, who have gone to more reverent and more open liturgies, such as the Fraternity of St. Peter here in Los Angeles. I mean, just a ton of new people. I was there just for a Saturday night, and there's a 7 p.m. Saturday night mass, and it was packed to the gills. So we have 5 masses on Sunday, and all the weekday masses are also booked. And it's a constant repetition of new faces. On our young adult app, there is a ton of new people. So it's a lot of people who are searching for God and for the truth, and they've found it. And maybe this is the first time they've ever experienced reverent liturgy in their life, and they can't go back. And in some cases, maybe they want to go back, of course. Like, let's be fair. I think a lot of people are probably going to be really surprised to know that St. Vitus is open, but they discover that it's a Latin Mass. But their parishes are closed. And unfortunately, I think what this is showing is the great issue for this next decade in the church. Church Militant highlights that this next decade is going to be filled with diocesan bankruptcies and church closures. And it's all very pessimistic news on that kind of front. And I can tell you from being at different parishes, not just here in LA, but back home in Colorado, that the Catholic Church at large does have a really big problem with an aging demographic. That's not just exclusive to the wider Catholic Church. This is happening, of course, we see the great hemorrhaging in mainland Protestantism. So there is a great lack of religiosity that is happening amongst the people. But also we see the policies of the church for the past 50 years coming to a head, which is why, again, I talked about a soft referendum on Vatican II. You're seeing a lot of commentators, both clergy and laymen, having an opinion on Vatican II, because the point is that there is a lot of churches that aren't going to be opening again. And there are a lot of dioceses which are going bankrupt as we speak. Diocese of Santa Fe, I think Diocese of Albany, plenty of other ones you would never even expect. And you're going to see this great consolidation. Here in Los Angeles, my fiance and I were in Southgate the other day. And what's cool about Los Angeles is it's a city where there's a Catholic church pretty much every 2-3 miles, you feel like. You're always close to home, so to speak, as a Catholic in LA. But the great sadness about this is that these churches have been ravaged not just by coronavirus, but by just banal liturgy and the lack of people. For one Catholic that comes in, 6 leave. And this next decade in particular, as my generation grows up and start having kids, we're like the last that are going to decide to either get really serious about the faith and return to tradition, return to orthodoxy, or we're going to stay away from the faith. And I can tell you, as watching so many of my friends from confirmation and friends from my entirety of my life, even ones who I never thought would never stop going to Mass, they've dropped off. There's been enough of them, quite a bit of them, where it is a tremendous concern. This is very sad, and I don't want to see that hurt. I don't want to see that bleeding, but I do know that's what part of understanding what the remnant is. It's Catholics returning to tradition. Orthodoxy are not going to go back to the parishes that didn't give them that, and that even if parishes are trying to turn in that direction, it might be too late. Looking at this church in Lansing, I wondered, it's a very spirit of Vatican II, shall we say, in terms of its architecture. The altar is a table, and it's a table pretty much in the center of the church, and you can sit on you can sit on 3/4, so you can look left, you can look right, you can look front at the altar, right? So instead of where in the Latin Mass or in the rited understanding of architecture, the altar separated by the altar rail, right, is very separate and always in the very back of the nave, and everyone looks that same way, including the priest. So, there's not a lot of decoration. There's not a lot of statues. There's felt banners. There's the whole kit and caboodle. I think one of the saving graces is the crucifix isn't bad, and the tabernacle is in the center, if I remember correctly. But, I always wonder when it comes to the talk of the Renovation, how many tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, in some cases millions, were spent really de-Catholicizing a church. And now in the 21st century, there are churches who are trying to raise a building fund campaign for a better, prettier, whatever kind of church, really rejecting a lot of the modernist bends that the church has had. But by then, they're in debt tens or hundreds or $1 million on the church itself. So we're very fortunate because, we have a very, very small, modest church. But our priests and the council that's running it are budget hawks, and so we paid off our debt in a year. And also it's a great reverence, and the fact that the Latin Mass or Orthodox tradition and love for a parish really should manifest in support for the parish, not just spiritually but financially as well. So I don't know, now that being said, I don't know what the ins and outs of this particular church that's closing's workings were, but if I had to guess, I bet you that would be a strain, because unfortunately that's a really common strain for a lot of people. So please pray for these parishioners who some of them have had the family in the community, in the church, since the inception, 99 years. And to suddenly be without a parish like that is a really big struggle. And as a Catholic, we should have an attachment to our home parish. Our priest once gave a homily and said, look, obviously because of the traditional Latin Mass, people are wandering from an hour and a half, 2 hours away sometimes. Fortunately for me, it's only 15 minutes. But that's important, because you're obviously here for the growth in Christ through rited liturgy. But in an ideal world, in a proper world for a Catholic, you should go to your local parish. And what we're trying to do with this greater understanding of bringing back tradition and orthodoxy is getting us to a world where, you don't have to travel an hour, 2 hours away to go to a right kind of mass, a mass that's going to fulfill you, not one where you have to fight oftentimes against yourself. You will just be able to walk down the street, and that church will offer a reverent Latin Mass. It'll offer a reverent rited liturgy. So, but please pray for these Catholics who have been understandably displaced in that sort of way. And the second thing I was thinking of, because again, I think that what we see is there's a separation of the wheat and the chaff. There are parishes whom the priests know that their job is the salvation of their flock, and they will do whatever they can, sometimes against the state's orders, in order to bring and distribute the sacraments. There are other parishes and other dioceses which you can't get a baptism. It's hard to get a reconciliation. You haven't had Eucharist in months. You're not getting married. And these are the real wretches of the faith. So my fiance went down to have a confession nearby her house. And again, this is the priest who generally speaking is trying to do the right thing. So it's nothing like that. But she asked the priest, she was picking up some supplies for her nephew because he's transferring Catholic schools, Deo gratias. And she asked for a confession. And the kind of priests that I love and the kind of priests who inspire me are ones who, as long as they're not doing something which is, that they need to do, they'll say, yeah, sure. Of course, come save your soul. Well, this priest kind of looked at her, and then he, looked at his phone, checking the time, which is okay. But he was like, yeah, sure, whatever. And the church that this is supposed to take place in, their confessionals aren't open. What I mean to say is confession happens in a pew inside the church looking at each other. Where the confessionals used to be in this really beautiful South Los Angeles church that obviously had confessionals built in is now used for storage. That's more Spirit of Vatican II for you, I'm sure. And instead, he went into the school office and closed the door, sat down, and just looked at her face to face, and that was a confession. And it's very funny because now that I'm so used to both the anonymity of confession, but also just the real severity of it, to go down to kneel in front of a priest, or to have the screen, of course, to confess your sins openly like that. It's not supposed to be a regular sort of conversational act of the sacrament. Confession is literally seeing the salvation of your soul. It is seeing yourself reconciling with God. And so, she made a confession, made a good confession. And he said something to the effects of how, your family doesn't really come here anymore. A little passive aggressively, shall we say. And, that's true. But the answer is because what's happening at that parish, what's happening at parishes all over the world isn't okay. And so, my fiance was like, well, no, I'm not. I mean, she's a trad now. There's no better way of saying it. She's a trad. And what does it mean to be a traditional Catholic? It means to follow Christ and Christ's church in the way that it's righted itself throughout history. And this oftentimes manifests, of course, in the traditional Latin Mass. And it's hard when you go back to a parish that was once home and you realize that it's not home. And it's hard when you realize that your attachment to things that you grew up with begin to change and morph. Now, I'm not a huge believer in like traditional triumphalism in that kind of way. Like, oh, it's good that parish dies, or that priest needs to be outed, that kind of thing. Again, I want more Catholic churches open, regardless at the moment if they're traditional Latin Mass or if they're Novus Ordo. I just want the Eucharist, I want the sacraments more widely available, not less. But it's true. At some point, you realize that your home lies with the tradition of the church. And so this next decade, really pray for a lot of Catholics, those who are giving up the faith, who are not going to go back to Mass. There's going to be an extremely sizable amount of them. Those whose churches are going to close. This next decade is going to be a great shrinkage of the church. The demographics aren't lying in this regards. And what you're going to see again is the growth of the Latin Mass. But this is going to be coming from new converts, a lot of new converts to the faith, but also it's going to be coming from Catholics who are seeking refuge from places that are not feeding them. And you're going to see greater calls for a referendum on Summorum Pontificum. You're going to see greater calls for a referendum on how the Latin Mass should be treated. Now you're seeing this understanding of, well, the Novus Ordo can be illuminated in the light of the traditional Latin Mass, but the Latin Mass also needs to be illuminated in the light of the changes for the Mass of Paul VI. And I think that that's a very disingenuous kind of call, honestly. I think that it's trying to rationalize something that isn't actually going to stick. If you understand the hermeneutic of continuity, it's very funny that in my life in the Novus Ordo, I've seen, the changes that Pope Benedict XVI made, thankfully, that gave the vernacular more of a direct translation from the Latin, through my fault, through my most grievous fault, that sort of thing. But again, what has the Latin Mass needed to really change? It adds, the greatest thing, of course, is that in 1962, Missal revised, we added, St. Joseph, some other things. But there's like, well, what's the takeaway here? And the answer is that I don't think really anything. I've not been in a Latin Mass, so I'm like, wow, it would really, really be good here right now? A tambourine. And it's not supposed to be triumphalism in that kind of regard, but it's just a real serious look at what liturgy and orthodoxy and faith are supposed to mean to Catholics. So again, just as we go through the last stages of coronavirus for some places, and if you're in California, it's going to go on, you can tell that they're trying to squash the liturgy. And you can also tell where your good priests are and where your bad priests are. And you can tell, where priests who are trying but are unfortunately fighting a losing battle, which is what I think ultimately is what this Lansing case is about. It doesn't seem like the priest is teaching heterodoxy. It seems like, that all in all, the parish is loved and cherished by those who go. And it's just unfortunate that 50 years onward from the Recavations and 100 years onwards from the inception of this parish, that such a wonderful force of Christ in that city is closing. And that's not good. Now, before I go, a little final takeaway, maybe a little bit of positivity, is this has also shown us who we need to follow as lay people, which bishops, which priests, which cardinals are going to really put our souls and our salvations up as the first priority of your parish. And that's been so wonderful. It's been wonderful to see that, in the midst of all this chaos, that, the Latin Mass is growing and that these priests are giving great homilies and good orthodoxy and are confirming and baptizing and marrying and reconciling and all the sorts of sacraments still distributed as much as they can. Our Lady of Mount Carmel, where I'll be going in Colorado, it's bursting at the seams, and it's a really great bit of good news. And I think as Catholics, we have to decide where to stake our hills, fight and die on. The fact that now Bishop Strickland in Tyler, Texas, celebrates his first Latin Mass. We saw that a couple weeks ago. And he talked about how it almost brought tears to his eyes because the reverence and the understanding of liturgy, and for as a priest to really feel yourself in persona Christe, to be righted, that kind of thing is only going to grow. It's not going to dispense. And what I really pray for is that more priests really step up and be the heroic witnesses to the faith that we need them to be. And I pray that more churches really begin to understand that sometimes you have to stop pinching incense to Caesar in order to save souls. So this whole lockdown is going to be bad for the church. It's been terrible. It has really shown that there are some priests and bishops out there who treat the sacraments as just a nice little icings on the cake rather than the ordinary means of salvation for the faithful. And so now that we see where the chips are falling with some of these people, we can now make better informed decisions as Catholics to vote with our faith, to vote with our feet, and to vote with our wallets. So just a couple thoughts for Monday. God bless you. May I keep you. No doubt we're going to have a podcast episode soon, I'm sure. So everyone, take care, and I'll see you very, very soon.